What if every currency collapse in history was not random at all, but part of a repeating financial pattern? Across different centuries and countries, governments fail in the same sequence of decisions that slowly destroys trust in money until it becomes worthless paper. From Germany in the 1920s to Zimbabwe in the 2000s and Venezuela in recent decades, the locations change, but the economic behavior remains almost identical. Each collapse begins quietly, long before the crisis becomes visible to the public. When you map these events on a timeline, something disturbing appears. They do not look like isolated disasters. Instead, they follow a structured sequence, almost like a financial script repeating itself again and again. Every currency collapse starts with one simple condition. Governments begin spending more money than they collect. At first, this gap seems manageable, but it slowly forces them into borrowing and financial shortcuts that weaken the system over time. As deficits continue, national debt increases year after year. Governments rarely stop this trend early because economic pressure makes borrowing seem easier than cutting spending or restructuring budgets. Eventually, governments reach a breaking point where borrowing is not enough. At this stage, they turn to the most dangerous tool in economics: creating new money to cover real financial gaps in the system. In post-World War I Germany, the economy was destroyed by war reparations and industrial collapse. Unable to pay foreign debts, the government began printing massive amounts of currency to survive short-term obligations. Zimbabwe faced a different trigger, but the same outcome. When agricultural production collapsed in the early 2000s, government revenue fell sharply, forcing authorities to rely heavily on printing money to fund basic operations. Venezuela, despite massive oil reserves, suffered from declining production and economic mismanagement. As income dropped, the government increased money supply instead of fixing structural problems in the economy. At this stage, money printing does not feel dangerous. In fact, it often creates a temporary illusion of economic stability because more money enters circulation and activity appears to increase. But soon, prices begin to rise quietly. Food, fuel, and rent start becoming more expensive. At first, people assume this is normal inflation caused by global economic conditions. Inflation at this stage is slow and almost invisible. But beneath the surface, the value of money is already beginning to weaken because too much currency is chasing the same amount of goods. As prices continue rising, people slowly lose confidence in saving money. They begin spending faster because they expect prices to be higher in the future than they are today. Governments usually respond by reassuring the public that inflation is temporary. They often blame external factors like war, supply shortages, or global instability instead of internal monetary policy. Even during early inflation, life appears normal. Shops remain open, salaries are still paid, and the currency still functions in everyday transactions without visible breakdown. Then suddenly behavior changes. People start rushing to spend money immediately after receiving it because they fear losing value if they wait even a few days or hours. Prices begin changing rapidly, sometimes multiple times per day. Businesses struggle to adjust, and economic planning becomes nearly impossible because value is constantly shifting. Zimbabwe reached extreme hyperinflation in 2008, with estimates reaching around 79.6 billion% inflation. Currency became so devalued that trillion-dollar notes were printed just to handle basic transactions. In Weimar Germany, currency lost value so quickly that workers were paid multiple times a day. People literally carried money in wheelbarrows because banknotes were too worthless to count efficiently. In Venezuela, inflation destroyed purchasing power so severely that even basic goods became difficult to obtain. Not because they didn't exist, but because money could no longer function as a reliable exchange system. The real collapse happens when trust disappears completely. At that point, money is no longer a store of value or medium of exchange, but simply paper with no economic meaning. Societies naturally revert to barter systems when currency fails. People begin trading goods and services directly because money no longer serves its intended purpose in daily life. In many cases, foreign currencies like the US dollar replace local money unofficially. This process happens quickly because people seek stable alternatives during financial uncertainty. Governments attempt emergency fixes such as new currency systems or monetary resets. However, without fixing underlying economic problems, these solutions rarely restore stability. Price controls are often introduced to stabilize markets, but they typically lead to shortages because producers cannot afford to sell goods below production cost. Eventually, economic collapse turns into social instability. Protests, unrest, and migration increase as people search for basic survival and financial security. In the modern era, global central banks created unprecedented amounts of money after 2020, injecting trillions into financial systems to stabilize economies during crisis conditions. In the United States, money supply expanded by more than 40% in a short period, marking one of the fastest expansions in modern financial history and impacting global inflation. The result was global inflation affecting nearly every major economy, increasing costs of living across food, housing, and energy sectors worldwide. Central banks responded by increasing interest rates aggressively, attempting to reduce inflation, but monetary policy changes always work with delay. When all historical collapses are compared, the same five-stage pattern emerges clearly: debt growth, money printing, inflation, loss of trust, and eventual collapse. This cycle repeats regardless of country, leadership, or time period, suggesting that the system itself follows predictable economic behavior under stress conditions. First takeaway: currency collapse is never sudden. It develops slowly over time through repeated policy decisions that gradually weaken financial trust. Second takeaway: money is fundamentally based on trust. When trust breaks, no amount of printing or policy intervention can restore its original value. Third takeaway: in a global financial system, economic shocks are not isolated. Instability in one region can quickly influence markets across the world. The most important question is not whether this pattern exists. History already proves it does. The real question is where we are in this cycle today, and whether we recognize the warning signs before the next stage begins.